Marco,
Here we go,
you're
Sean.
ready to roll.
I am.
It's
Always.
story time.
Story time. I mean, with all the end of the year, the beginning of the year, kind of lost the rhythm, but we're quickly getting back on it for 2025, and I'm glad that this is with someone we already had on the show before.
I know we've had the pleasure of speaking with Chase and hearing about all the good things that JumpCloud's doing. You met Chase, but you decided to not join us for that chat.
There was not enough time,
It
if
was
I
a
get
short
on,
chat.
it's gonna take time. I'm Italian,
Exactly.
and I talk, so
Exactly.
I didn't want to take too much time from Chase, but this time I'm very happy to be on board.
I know. I'm happy to have you on as well.
Yeah.
So it's good to see you again, Chase.
Likewise, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have both of you to chat with today, so it'll be fun information that we're able to dive into.
You're going to get two different perspectives coming at you today, and hopefully everybody listening and watching enjoy it. So before we dig in, a few words about you and your role at JumpCloud, and then maybe kind of an overview of what JumpCloud does so people have that perspective. As we dig in, we're going to look at some data you've been researching for a few years now and kind of see how that's shaping business and security in the business. So a little bit about you, Chase, and then JumpCloud.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a principal strategist here at JumpCloud, and that's just kind of a fancy way of saying I help kind of transform a lot of our customer stories and out into the market. And a key piece of this is a lot of the data that we are generating kind of both internally as well as receiving externally, and just making the larger IT community aware and kind of more informed as they evolve, right? Is certainly within this industry, and then also provide benchmarks in what that looks like. And then in terms of JumpCloud, we provide a really simplified, unified IT platform that brings together kind of all your identity and access management and device management and the insights that you need in order to lay down and make sure that your organization is secure and compliant and all these other goals that IT teams have. And so we really centralize a lot of the different tools and jobs to be done that affects IT admins and kind of IT teams on the ground floor, and making sure that they're successful and everyone is able to work, right? And so that's really the ultimate goal that we have here at JumpCloud.
Very cool. So let's start from the beginning or the past.
Yes.
In this industry, if there's one thing I've learned is that there is a lot of reports because things change really quick. Data is the oil or whatever you want to call it, more and more. So I know you guys have been doing these reports, the IT admin reports for years, every 6 months. So there is a little history here, which in tech, it's a long history. 4 years is forever ago, right?
That's whole companies have come and gone. So.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. So just to sort of get the flavor of where we're going with the new report, the history of it very quickly, mostly what you think has changed the most since the first one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess first in terms of context, I'll start with kind of why, right? And kind of why we did this and kind of years ago. We saw this gap where there's a lot of information, a lot of reports, as you mentioned, right? And they're typically geared much more towards the enterprise, right? Here's kind of where your magic quadrants, your waves are going, kind of here's kind of what industry leaders and CISOs are doing. And that's great. And we need that. And there's a lot of thought leadership in where that takes us. But in terms of the sheer number of organizations, there's not many people that are in that role. There's many more people that are running small to medium enterprises. And that's really where we're targeting. And so these are organizations from 50 people to kind of 5,000, kind of within that range, which is still really broad. But the types of problems and other pieces that those teams are able to deal with and kind of strategize around and making sure that they have that, it's been really different. And so what we did is we really set out to have this report to provide information specifically for that category of kind of, hey, here's how you can kind of benchmark a little bit more on your peers. Here's how MFA is involved. Here's how people are leveraging biometrics and single sign-on and some of those other elements that really help engage a lot of those folks that are often IT and security hats and 5 other hats that they're trying to get into. And so that's really kind of where we started. And one of the things that's been really interesting over the last several years that we've been conducting this research is, there's been bigger topics that will start to insert themselves. Obviously, AI is one, right? And then we kind of start tracking that. But then there's also been longer running ones just in terms of like, hey, what does the device mix look like across your organizations? And that's been interesting to see because you kind of basically see, Windows and Apple kind of dealing now, but then Linux pops up every now and then, right? As just more usage, different GUIs available, kind of other different elements. And then also to how people are leveraging different areas around their organization, like biometrics I mentioned, right? We kind of keep watching that metric kind of continue to go up along with single sign, which is great. And that's the healthy metric we want to have. It's not as fast as we'd like it to have, or kind of some of these other notions. And then we also ask just some other areas, right? Like, do you have a security person on staff? That continues to grow up. And also too, we manage and look at budget cycles, which is really important in terms of, hey, you have teams and people, and the tools that you need to be successful, that fluctuates a lot from year to year. And then we also you can tie it somewhat into macro developments and kind of other pieces. The other element too is we try as much as possible to have a global perspective, right? And so for this report, we covered the US, the UK, and Australia. And then previous reports, we've also added in India and other pieces. So it's not just kind of, hey, here's what the US is doing, which is also tends to be more of a perspective that a lot of reports have. But we really try to broaden that view in terms of, how is this affecting different organizations? Because a small and medium organization is different from one geographic to another. But a lot of the best practices and other elements that you want to have amongst those teams, those start to change a little bit more interchangeably. And so that's kind of a lot of the variation that we've seen across the reports, but then also kind of why we do it in the first place and why we continue to do it.
Yeah, actually, Sean, before you go, I love the cross-cultural look at things, because especially when you talk about small, medium businesses, there is always something to learn from what's going on in another country, in another region. And the small, medium business, sometimes they're not the multinational that they can afford to go and look around and have their own independent offices to see what's going on in the region. So the fact they're doing it for them, I think is pretty cool. Yeah.
And it's a great opportunity for folks to just have that insight and just know if they're, are we on the right track or not? But it at least allows them to have more informed decisions when talking with leadership, kind of why we should have some of these different pieces. Hey, it's not just me, right? There's a lot of other people that are dealing with, these types of initiatives, or kind of here's how that we approach. And so it's really kind of empowering a lot of people just kind of make, more operationally significant decisions, because one of the other elements too is we've seen IT and security become much more elevated in terms of their role and impact within organizations, right? CISOs taken much more seriously than they have in the past, and just these notions of kind of all these different areas where it's life or death, right? Especially in a lot of the cybersecurity threat landscape, and people know that now, and so a lot of those conversations are being really elevated, which is great to see.
Yeah, and I'm glad Marco kind of teed that up, because I wanted to look at it not just from a cultural perspective, but from a maturity perspective and an investment perspective. It's also kind of to your point of there's a lot of attention given to the enterprise, which is like the top sliver, right? The 1%, if you will, that have the budget, they have the maturity, they have the team, they have the tech, they have the culture, they have what they need to kind of embrace innovation, drive it, hopefully do security by design along the way. Below that, it's a mix of all kinds of fun things. Some lead with innovations, some lead with being very adverse to risk, so they do select technology and don't overwhelm their team. So I guess what I'm trying to get to is, and I don't know if it's in the report or not, or your experience working with customers in this small medium business space and the MSP community that supports them. How much is innovation driving investments in tech and security? You mentioned AI. Do you see a lot of business drivers saying, we have to compete, we have to differentiate, we have to innovate, and therefore IT needs to step up and find the tech, staff the team, bring on partners, secure all this stuff? Or do you see it more still being risk adverse and not pushing things too hard in the stack and the team perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the elements that I'd say most departments, but like IT really, they get hammered and say like, you got to do more with less. And that's been the mantra since ever. And so usually when you think about innovations, it's really kind of how can I automate and orchestrate more of kind of the impacts and making sure that my customer service to our internal users, but then also future forward security, compliance goals, other things that IT is tasked with. And really around innovation is, a lot of it has been parked in AI initiatives, right? And because like that's kind of the next thing where we think that we can have more meaningful progress than we have in the past. And what we found too, and we'll cover this in the research, is we ask in terms of, hey, what's the number of AI initiatives that you might have either, and this is either within your team or kind of across departments, other pieces. And when we started capturing this type of data, it was, kind of across the board, hey, people are really in it and we're moving fast, or we're not, and we're kind of in the laggards. And you had a really kind of nice curve. Now, actually, in the last 6 months, that has flipped, where you're seeing much more of this polarization where you've committed to AI initiatives and you are moving faster, or the folks that haven't are not, right? And so there's a lot more people that are no longer the middle ground, where they're kind of like they're hopping on board and they're going to do it. And that also tends to be a little bit more reflected in terms of the pacing. So we ask kind of like, hey, what speed are you at with your initiatives if you started one? And what is really interesting is a lot of organizations, almost 70% say like, hey, we're doing it exactly at the speed that we want, or I'm kind of calling it our Goldilocks zone. And you got another like 15% over here, too fast, too slow. And that's been really interesting. We kind of keep watching that, and it hasn't moved a lot. And we think the reason is because AI is really tied into a lot of the security initiatives. And so a lot of IT teams are pulling it in, say, hey, yes, we want to do it. We should invest in it. And we're going to govern it. We're going to see how this impacts the organization, because there is a huge concern that the adoption of AI will outpace their ability to protect the organization. And so you're seeing this pacing that's kind of really being set by IT. And so there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of focus, and not everything's always equal, right? And so how you implement, a Gen AI kind of for the marketing team and the sales teams is a little bit different than handing it over into your ticketing and support teams. Like there's still really big initiatives. They both have costs. And so now it's kind of up to IT in terms of where should we do it and kind of have our implementation time and effort spread across the organization. And then what's going to have the most bang for the buck, right? Because that kind of falls back into, more often than not, it's their budget too. And so we're seeing budgets increase, but it's part of it is capturing, hey, there's some new licensing costs, but then also like there's other security concerns that go along with that too. So there's this tandem approach that as IT and securities get elevated in more organization, you have more budget and a lot more responsibility in terms of what those impacts might be.
It's actually interesting that there's actually like a view of, well, let's ask IT and security first instead of let's do it and then, maybe we can patch it later. I think this is good news.
There is. And we're starting to see this mode where IT decisions are kind of becoming more decentralized, if you will, right? And so we want to, and part of it is just the structure and way people work, right? And so we started capture say, hey, we kind of went fully remote, and we're actually seeing more and more people return into the office and other elements. So like there's kind of this location physicality that you've had, but people have been much more empowered to say like, hey, I'm gonna go try this new tool. I'm gonna grab that in. And that's a double-edged sword, right? Because you want to empower folks, but then at the same time, shadow IT has become much more of a concern than ever before, right? Because we don't know if people are throwing things into different AI models. We don't know what they're using. How do we grant control? So like we want to have that. And so then you also have, if it becomes unwieldy, then you get in situations too, where teams might adopt a tool and they're kind of self-paying or something like that. And now that team's kind of KPIs and reporting is all kind of stuck there. And like, well, how do I unravel that? Especially if you have applications that have overlapping feature functionality, right? And so it's like the Figmas and the Miros of the world. And like, well, we like one or the other. And we're like, well, we're not going to pay for both of those. And then you have new entrants that will just kind of come in all the time, right? DeepSeek just popped up. And so how do you understand kind of how many people are using that now versus a transition? Do we have even policies around AI usage and some of those other elements? One of the things that we found in terms of understanding that too is like 21% of organizations just don't even have an AI policy yet. And so you can start to see some of those different cracks and kind of how people are trying to put it together while maintaining, hey, we want you to innovate. We want you to feel like you can have work. And we don't want to become a department of no. And I think that's another big element that we're seeing in IT organizations is, hey, we'll defer and elevate and kind of empower a lot of our folks, but we want to make sure we can do it securely. So that's the balance that we're seeing a lot here.
Yeah, super interesting. And I'm wondering if, are there any other data points you want to pull on from past to present that kind of signify a change in culture or maturity, or how tech is driving things, or anything else from the report you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we've continued to track is kind of like the bigger elements. One is budget. And so, kind of coming back into the money where that drives kind of the possibilities that organizations have. And within that budget, we're actually seeing the pie not only increase, but then also across different areas. And so more and more is being put more towards security tooling, right? And that's the fastest growing kind of budget line item that people are having. And that's really kind of within that mix. And then also too, kind of how people deal with other macro types of elements, right? Kind of coming back into the office. So now we actually see, this has been a really big trend, especially within just the last 6 months, where only 9% of the folks that we talked to said, hey, no, we are still fully remote. For everyone else, they're starting to see mandates or kind of, hey, it'd be great if you could come in just a couple of days a week. And there's this more of a locationality that's changed. And so you kind of had this, kind of bigger shift from everyone's in the office, everyone's not in the office. And now guess what? You have to do both, right? And so this is really hard for a lot of IT teams where they're kind of coming back into, now I got to worry about printer drive network errors and kind of, what is the local network on the office, and making sure people, like all those kind of basic blocking and tackling that we kind of forgot about in the last couple of years as people kind of come into this. And so there's just been changes in terms of how IT has been also interacting with their different stakeholders and where they might be in the world.
I want to know, Marco probably wants to jump in, but on this budgeting thing, you described IT kind of being more distributed, so businesses taking on some of it just because the tooling allows them to, right? IT doesn't have to get involved in as many things. Business can actually run it. And you said investments are moving toward security as well. Mm-hmm. Does that mean security teams are also picking up some of the IT stuff?
Yes. And I think it's starting to have a similar moment in terms of when you saw with when DevOps became a thing, right? And so, hey, we're kind of having this merging of like, they're not really different silos where you're starting to see IT and SecOps kind of all start to come together. And when you think about it, it's really around who owns what across the identities, devices, all those different pieces. Guess what? Those are all really crucial pieces of information for security now, because we've seen that permissions are now the perimeter, right, of kind of how people get into organizations, kind of hacks and leaks and other pieces. And that's really driven by who's doing what on what device. Well, IT kind of owns that. Security wants to know that information. So there's this merging, but in order to really accelerate what teams are able to do, and you see this as well as kind of the different kill chains are starting to accelerate now with AI and more automation, they're moving faster. So how do we move faster too? And so there's this natural blend of overlap and responsibilities that we're starting to see across, where IT is tasked with more security objects just because they have their hands on it. And security is now thinking in terms of IT, in terms of this is our primary enabler. Like if we're trying to get SOC 2 Type 2, if we're trying to go after ISO, if it's any number of acronyms of compliance, well, guess what? You're working at the hip. And so we're actually seeing more organizations put IT and security within similar department roles versus, traditionally like IT was kind of part of finance in a lot of organizations because it was seen as a cost center, right? Not necessarily kind of an operational I'd say, offensive, type of role when you're thinking about that strategy.
Yeah, I love that you went there because I'm thinking how the role has changed. Mm-hmm. Even the meaning of reports. So I'm a marketing and branding person. So for me, every time a company is doing a report, it's just another way to sell what they have. Not, in general, But the truth
Meta selling.
But the truth is that while you do this report, you're just saying this, you uncover certain path in the business, where the business is going, where security is going, where the budget is going. And I'm curious to know how, not much how your customer react to the report, but how your product, your service improve because of this report. because I think it's important, to think it's not just a selling tool, but it's a tool for a better security.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's different pieces of this report that specifically JumpCloud can lean on and help support. Because again, within most organizations, we're managing your identity, we're managing your device. We've merged those two, and now we have access points around that and the reporting, as well as just the verification that goes in with that. Right? We have our own MFA tools, password manager, kind of all those different building blocks that you need within the organization. And now the fun part is how you bring all those different elements together, and then what are you empowered to do? So more specifically around this, one other element that we saw is kind of the explosion of SaaS apps, right? Everyone's kind of using SaaS apps, but now even more so because it's SaaSapps.ai, right? And so now there's a whole bunch of other slew of categories of folks that are trying different organizations, and that's really kind of where the venture money is going. So there's a lot of time and focus here, and realize there's a gap, right? People are using a bunch of different software you didn't use. It was kind of outside of the world of SSO. And so that's kind of, we also introduced our own SaaS management capabilities. So that way we're providing that visibility for admins to at least understand, right? Of kind of like, hey, we want to block ChatGPT, or we want to block DeepSeek, or we don't. And we at least want to monitor and know where people are going and spending their time, because that's a huge gap in visibility that relates back into security, what you're able to do about it. And that kind of how it informs a little bit more of kind of where we're taking our own platform, and then also how we can help serve the future needs, right? Because if there's anything around this, we're trying to also look for our own trend lines and understand of like, how can we get ahead of where this merger of IT and security is, what's going to be the next helping thing. And that kind of helps just inform, us being good stewards of our own data and kind of our own homework of kind of where the industry is going. So it is a little self-serving because, we want to understand where the industry is going before everyone else, but we're excited to share those data points and really kind of help organizations just understand where their own big gaps are, right? And making sure that they're able to react.
Yeah, and coupling it with real world experience working with your customers, I'm sure that it's the 1-2 punch that really makes it really powerful. And I want to maybe look at some of the operations, because you talk about these interactions between different groups, and ultimately it's about enabling the business, right? Mm-hmm. So onboarding users, giving them access to stuff, enabling them to do their job, giving them making sure the business processes and the workflows are smooth, there aren't too many blocking points. So can you talk to how the report data maps to what businesses are trying to do from a pure business perspective, and how you can actually help serve that need, not just be the one that makes IT run faster, right?
Run faster, go faster. Yeah, absolutely. So I think more specifically, like there's certain elements. So for example, I'll pick on kind of our device management capabilities and what that looks like. And so first you kind of have this notion of what devices are out there. So in the report, we've been capturing since its inception, right? Kind of what is the device mix that you see across Windows, OS, Linux, kind of other pieces. But then more recently, we also introduced kind of, okay, that's great, but how often are you actually keeping those systems up to date and patched? And that's one of those elements where you can actually start to see, and it was about 30% kind of do it all within a couple hours, very kind of like best in breed practices. Another 40% are like, well, kind of, a couple days, right? We'll kind of roll out and you can, okay. And then the rest kind of falls off. Then it goes into weeks and months and other things. So you have this really interesting trend line of, arguably, you want to be running on your latest and making sure that your device is up to date, not to mention all the other applications that you're using. And a lot of organizations do it immediately. Great. That shows me that there's automation. That shows me that pieces are being brought into the organization and they're doing it on behalf of the users. And then you have this trail off and you're like, okay, well, that's not the best, right? Because now, as soon as there are changes or there's vulnerabilities, that is that whole section, right? That becomes much more vulnerable compared to the earlier half. And so that's really why we're trying to focus and say, hey, leverage a lot more of the automation capabilities that we have, just even in that one instance and scenario. So that way you can make sure that the organization is more secure.
Very cool. So what is the organization's, let's say, what's the biggest topic that you think or area that they're struggling the most?
It's really been around security. And I know that like that's the hard one because it's a big umbrella term, but we always ask and through each of these reports kind of like, hey, where's your mind at? What keeps you up? And it's security by far, right? And it kind of there's also budgets and layoffs and I'd say organizational changes, but that is really where people are spending time. And then then it starts to break down into that keeps me up because of networking access. That keeps me up because my devices are either not secure or I don't know where they are in the first place, right? Or kind of what our users are up to and what are they accessing, kind of, and then making sure that I have visibility into, what is the digital representative of myself, right? Because I'm physical hanging out here in Colorado, but my digital identity could be up to any number of things. And that is kind of the access work that they're trying to get ahead of, right? And making sure that people have one centralized view is really hard. And so another question that we'll typically ask is like, hey, how many tools do you typically have to kind of bring all this together? There's kind of like 4 or 5% really that only use kind of like that one Goldilocks tool that cover everything. But most organizations sit within kind of this anywhere from 5 to 10 to kind of do everything else. And then it goes up from there, right? And so there's so many just different more places that admins need to go to even have an understanding of who's been up to what and on what device and who gave them access in the first place and, kind of all those different elements. And so that's been really interesting to see as you start to bring some of those pieces together and really kind of how it empowers those teams to move a little bit faster.
So I could probably summarize that the biggest issue is visibility.
It's visibility. And we're starting to see, as I mentioned, kind of shadow IT creep up. When we say, hey, how much of a concern is 88%. So like that was a real big red flag in terms of this is where I was going. Like I feel more confident in my devices now. I feel more confident now that, people have gotten really good about remote onboarding, offboarding, kind of other systems just because they had to, right? And so now actually that is really stable. But now we're starting to see what are the other gaps in visibility? And that's really where people are honing in on.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, as you probably know very well, Chase, having visibility is a great first step, necessary first step. Being able to make decisions based on that, and because you kind of touched on, you touched on the idea that there might be teams deploying the same type of capabilities through different tools or services. Mm-hmm. It's not just the potential security risk, but there's budget issues there with that as well. So having that view, but then knowing what to do with that information. So what of those services provide the best value? That's a business decision. What of those services and technologies have risks and vulnerabilities associated with them? And bringing that all together to drive a better organization operationally that addresses the budget, addresses the business workflows, and also the risk management piece. Mm-hmm. And so how do your customers work with you to kind of use that visibility to drive some of those changes that are meaningful, not just we're gonna tackle this, we're gonna tackle that, we're gonna shut that down, that kind of, but more of a strategic view using that information?
It's the interesting piece about that is, it changes just because it does, right? So standard, say, consultant answer. But the more interesting piece is it changes as you do this differently across different geographies, right? Because different elements, not only just different, I'd say, applications come into the fold, but then also just how people work is a little bit differently, right? And so like, I'd say, US America is like, we're terrible users. Like we're very rogue. We go off, we try everything, we sign up for stuff, we throw things into different models because there's this notion of we just want to try so many different areas. And then if you look at kind of stand back beyond that, other pieces of the world really have more partnership driven, right? Either working directly with their managed service provider or kind of value added person. So as we are thinking about tooling decisions, there's another person involved in how we can do that. And really our goal within JumpCloud is kind of, hey, we will help provide a lot of the raw data. And just in terms of like, just that, like where people are going, kind of what are they spending their time on other pieces. But then it helps kind of transform other habits in terms of where people can spend their time strategically, kind of looking at, okay, what is my total cost of ownership, if you will, or kind of what's the total cost of the role that I need to attack? And do I need all these different tools? Is there overlap? And there might be good reason for that, right? There might be different signals from one provider or another, or the way that this allows my team to move faster. I'm okay with that, right? Because, there's other elements. But then there's more often than not of, I have all these different things. So one of my favorite sneaky features that we introduced, right, is kind of when people go and they visit a site and say, kind of coming back into the Figma Miro, just kind of example, or, you could do, Atlassian or kind of any other kind of elements or CRMs or whatever that might be, where people are trying it out, is actually we can guide folks and be like, hey, this is actually not the authorized version. We want you to go here, and it will redirect folks. And that's the biggest element, right? Is you can be as strategic as you want, but people habits die hard. And so the more that we can have those nudges and really just point people gently in the right direction, that helps the speed, right? That kind of slows down the adoption of unwanted tools, other pieces. But then it also provides an option for both. Because again, like as I mentioned, you don't want to become the department of no, and you're just kind of, hey, we're just going to have a block list and hope you figure it out. And kind of, here's kind of the 4 or 5 whitelisty things if you talk to another team member. But the more that you're able to have that from a pure end user perspective and kind of, hey, it just helps me. It's like, oh, I didn't know that. Or, I might have been recently hired and wasn't sure, right? There might be other political reasons why we were adopting a tool or not. Like there's those elements that you want to have in, and making sure that you just have a custom message and say, look, we're deprovisioning on these reasons, and here's why. And more often than not, once people have that, they're like, yeah, okay, right? Because they trust the business to make good decisions. They just might not know about it all the time. And so that's the other element that we really wanted to surface.
And I like to think as the user, right? So I have a feeling that those that are not adopting really fast or take a little bit of time, but the one that are like, no, I'm not going there, I think it's because they think about the disruption that it's going to bring to their business. Like, what if they come, I take this new tool, this new part comes in and it's all screwed up, right? Yeah. And I cannot do my business anymore, and I have to change things.
That's why Marco likes me.
Yeah, exactly. So my question for you is, for those that are listening right now, and maybe they're not using JumpCloud, give me a picture of, I realize that I need it. I'm going to, bite the bullet. I'm going to do it. I call you guys. What's the first step? Is it the way, is this as painful as I'm picturing it in my head, or is more of a, a nice progress, step by step?
It's always going to be nice, obviously. That's how, all of software ever
the answer
created.
was already in the question.
Exactly. No, but there is some nuances. And I guess one of the pieces that I'll start with is, first, I'd like to have a conversation, because guess what? IT has all the different things going on, and this actually might just be 1/10 of that. There might be other projects that are going on that are capturing a lion's share, kind of what leadership is up to and other elements. And so what we really start to do is we start to just understand, okay, like what's in your existing environment, kind of what's your stack, what's most painful, kind of what's getting you, creating friction that we can start to remove, right? So for a lot of folks, we'll start with, maybe it's their devices, and just say, hey, we don't manage all those. Well, guess what? We're a unified endpoint manager, so we touch everything. And so that way we can actually come in and be like, here's one pane of glass for what that looks. For other folks, it might be like, hey, we're really struggling, or maybe we're a brand new organization and we just need better handle on our identities, right? And so for a lot of folks, it's like your first notion of identity is a Gmail address that you might have created, but it's not true. I'd say, entitlements management, understanding access, putting, conditional access on key resources. So that way, not everyone gets AWS prod access. Sorry, like we're not going to do that. So, but making sure that you have those different pieces. And that's really kind of where we work with a lot of folks. And then we do have a lot of customers say like, look, I'm ready. Here's kind of what that looks like when they want to do that complete overhaul, because they know that the value will be there, right? And so, and I'll kind of go into that end state is, thinking as a user. Imagine you just joined an organization, you might be remote, you get a device, it shows up in your front door, you open it up, great. You create a password that's only for you and you know that, and now you're into everything that you need. Like device onboarding is done in 5 minutes, right? Because everything has been pre-configured for you, right? It's a JumpCloud managed device. We know that we're able to take that. We've bound your digital identity to your device identity. And now that we've done that, we're also provisioning access into all the different applications that you need. So using single sign-on and several different protocols, whether it's SCIM or SAML or OpenID Connect, to making sure that your digital identity is now provisioned, you have access at the right level too, right? So I just joined as a QA tester, right? Where I might have access to certain clusters and not others. Or kind of, I might be, a product manager. So I need like 4 different devices. Well, now they're either physical or digital, but I'm all tied across all those, right? And so I only need to remember kind of that one password to kind of get into all those different resources because we've unified that. And so if you think about from an end user perspective, that's pretty slick. Like I'm able to focus on my onboarding so much faster. I can actually contribute to the company instead of fighting with IT just to kind of get into my Salesforce instance to kind of, understand like a lot of those really painful moments that we've all had. Like we've all been onboarded at different organizations, and there's always been this moment of like, oh my God, can you please? Or, and this really started with device choice. People started coming in with MacBooks, and like I'm one of those. Like I've been working my whole career on Mac. If I had to switch over to Windows hotkeys, like I'd take a week off of work. I could just no. But providing that really allows people to move faster, especially from the user perspective. And then there's a lot of benefits on the tail end for IT. Because guess what? Now that unified identity, device, everything else, if I need to do offboarding, I just move access to everything, right, that user has because it's all centralized, right? Versus offboarding, it used to be a chore and kind of go through an individual accounts and kind of other pieces. And I've had that experience too. And not to say that I was nefarious, but in a previous company I left and I still had AWS access. So I was like, well, that's very generous of you. But that's one of the bigger gaps that IT and people teams, they struggle with. So the more that you can automate and centralize there, it actually makes the organization safer, much faster and more efficient. And that's really why a lot of organizations come and join JumpCloud and making sure that we can help them solve those problems.
Did you mine any coins successfully?
That is the other application that we gently pre-install on the back end.
So I love that user experience example. I think it's fantastic. Talk to me, as we start to wrap up here, talk to me about the IT and security team experience in making that happen. Because I'm picturing LDAPs and Active Directories and open directories and all for Linux and Windows and Macs and multiple devices, different operating systems and a bunch of different applications. It becomes a rat's nest just thinking about it. But so making that process simple for what are the policies, what are the rules, who do they apply for, how do we ensure they're enforced, how do we provide exceptions? Can you give an example or maybe even a story from a customer where that was also simplified by working with you and your team at JumpCloud?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the different elements, there's this notion, what I like to call it, like identity schizophrenia, right? You have one personality, but there's 10 other chases. They're all digital, and who knows what they're up to. And that gets really hard, especially as you mentioned, they might be living in either an LDAP instance or an old Active Directory forest or somewhere. But odds are, guess what? That identity was originally created in an HR system. Where does that come into? And making sure it's integrated. And then you pull up, and then you might even have people who use, I'd say, an Entra ID or a Google Workspaces, and that's kind of their first notion of their digital identity. So it's all across those different pieces. And so the more that we can bring that in, well, that gives us a little bit more power. And now we can actually bring that into devices, right? And so we're taking away some of this mix. But then the neat part is, right, as you're getting to and kind of, that's great. It helps me move faster. It helps people onboard. But how does it make it more secure? Well, we've actually done a lot of those different elements where you can actually start to bring it into that whole flow, right? And so we have our own push MFA. We also have a passwordless option, right? And so that way, even using the biometrics of your device, because we've joined all those different certificates and are managing that, so I don't even need to remember a password. I can just get into those instances and it saves all those kind of pieces and it's doing it securely. And then you can also start to, well, I want to update my device, my password in general. We can actually do that at the device level. So now any email you get, well, like we know that that's a phishing scheme, right? Because I can do it at a whole different way, medium that is much more secure because we're able to bring all those different elements into each other. And so that really allows people and security teams and other things to kind of meld a little bit more. And also too, from the very beginning, one of the other features that I have is like, we have this templated policies just based on kind of guidance that you want to say like, hey, I want this MacBook, I'm going to kind of medium policies, other things. Great. So in the background, we're already running file vault, we're changing background screens, kind of all those different pieces that you typically have either one-off commands or kind of that's on your checklist as you go through and kind of fire up a new device. Well, we're doing that for you automatically. And then guess what? We're keeping it patched and up to date. And then we're kind of making sure that all the applications that are on the device we know about, and those are up to date. And so there's this whole notion where because you're able to do so much more, it impacts both IT and security because you're able to have a great posture from the beginning instead of spending your time in a reactionary mode of kind of hunting down, I don't know, there's the random sales guy over there and kind of what is he running on and why does he need to, like, no, you're in the driver's seat. And the benefit of that is because we're able to meld those, it actually is kind of like the first time where security and productivity increase at the same time. Usually there's this big friction, right? Like more security tools, I have to go find my 6-digit code and I got to go do all the other things. Where the more that you're able to meld those, that actually makes the user faster, and they're more secure by not even realizing it though too. And that's, been really helpful as we see a lot of those different instances.
Love that.
Yeah.
I have a question. What's the next report about?
Fun things, let me tell you. So we actually, so there's kind of two different notions that we're looking at. First is this ongoing trends report, right? So we typically ask a lot of the same questions so we can have a trailing, and then we also add in new pieces. And so we're starting to see and kind of uncover a little bit more around shadow IT and kind of what does that look like. I think we're going to start to transition to and kind of like compliance and kind of how people come into that. That's a lot of people's new benchmark. And they're using these different technologies, identity, who had access to what on what device. Guess what? Those are compliance-based reports and kind of understanding what that looks like. So probably diving in a little bit more. And we actually also commissioned a brand new report. I'm excited to be talking about. We'll be releasing it here to the public in a little bit more, but it's specifically about kind of that IT and security relationship. And so we actually took it from security's perspective. Say, hey, what do you think about your IT counterparts? Kind of how do you work with them, other pieces? And we're going to have a lot more data points to share around that, which is, as I mentioned, it's becoming a really unique relationship and it's starting to blend more and more. And so the more that we can provide kind of an understanding and say, hey, what does the other side of the aisle think about you, right? And how you plan and strategize. Again, that's feeding those teams and making sure that I can show up and be more strategic. These are kind of how they think about those different areas. And they might be going after different pieces, but the priorities might look differently. And so that's kind of where we're starting to tie in those different areas.
Wow, look at you. You know the future.
You know the future.
We try, I lose money on lottery all the time,
but you get this
well,
right.
That's a little bit different. That's a little bit different.
I love it. It's always great to chat with you, Chase. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about those new reports when they come out as well. But for now, I want to thank everybody for listening and watching. Hopefully you can connect with Chase and the JumpCloud team, grab a copy of the current report, stay tuned for future reports, and get a jump start on your device and identity management. Efficiencies to user workflows, efficiencies to IT and security processes. I love it.
Yeah, we just want to get things done, So let's just enable that and make sure we can do it.
Very cool. All right. Well, thanks, Chase. Thanks, Marco.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good conversation. Please do stay tuned. We'll include links to the report and to connect with JumpCloud and Chase. And stay tuned for more brand stories here on ITSP Magazine.